Hey, so for my episode today, I want to try something a little bit different. I'm going to do a solo episode. I think I'm calling it Let's Muse, where I'm just going to muse. I'm going to think out loud a little bit about a topic that I think is really interesting and that I would love to talk with you about. So if you're listening to this on your podcast app, you'd like to talk a little bit more about it, please swing over to either my YouTube channel or LinkedIn profile, where I'll be posting this as well. And I'd love to talk about it because I think there are some very interesting developments going on right now in the nicotine space. Specifically, there have been two news items that really caught my eye that really are interesting and I think a little bit complicated to break down. So, one is there was just a Cochrane review released about vaping as a pathway to quitting smoking. And the second thing that I want to touch on a bit is the new manufacturing plant that Philip Morris is building in Colorado, $600 million to manufacture more Zyn nicotine pouches. And I think so. But my mind is noodling over this in a couple different ways, and I'd love to run some ideas by you and just get your take too. So I think starting with the first part, when it comes to vaping as being an alternative to smoking, to get people off of smoking, why this was so notable to me was this was the original proposed use case for vapes. You've got all these chemicals, many of which are toxic, and tar that come from cigarettes. And the idea originally was, well, what if we vape instead? What if we bring people from smoking to vaping? They get fewer chemicals, they get no tar, and it's overall a value add. And the interesting part about that is that idea hasn't necessarily gone away. The waters just got very, very muddied over time with what's happened with flavors and youth use and marketing towards youth, basically bringing people into nicotine who weren't already there. But there's still this underlying potentially useful nugget of, well, what if we could reduce harm by moving people away from smoking? And what the Cochrane review found was that yes, this does seem to work, and in fact, it works better than our nicotine replacement therapy options that are FDA approved. And there's a couple things that are very interesting to me about this. The first is that this actually makes some sense on its face, right? Like if we think about what vaping is, it's a stronger nicotine hit than cigarettes without the aversive stimuli, right? So you're not having the negative taste, the same really negative mouthfeel. So you're getting throat feel as well. So it makes a lot of sense that not only would it help people switch if that's what they wanted to do, but also that it might be better than NRT, nicotine replacement therapy, because the gums and the patches, they don't taste like watermelons or blueberries or any of those sorts of things. And which isn't to say that NRT doesn't work, it does, but there's this more natural reward from the nicotine hit to the flavors from vaping. And what's so interesting to me about this is I did another podcast actually with Jamie Ducharme, the author of Big Vape. I encourage you to go listen to that episode if you haven't already. But it was looking at Juul and the arc that Juul took in terms of going from at least purportedly well-meaning founders trying to reduce harm from cigarettes to this essentially the reason why the youth vaping epidemic launched, which had a lot to do not just with the flavors, because those we do know disproportionately appeal to young people, even if adults like them too, but also a very viral youth-focused marketing campaign that instead of making it centered in public health, instead made it centered in like social media viralism, really getting caught on with youth, being a lifestyle marketing campaign, kind of like putting vapes into the zeitgeist of what does it mean to be young, cool, and hip. And when you look at the story of that arc of Big Vape, either the book or the docuseries on Netflix, it really feels like there was some moment there where Juul lost their way. And they started thinking more about the sale and the money and the profit and how they can market it than about really what that original use case was all about. And so when I look at the Cochrane review, in some ways, again, it's good to see the data, and it's good to know that, yeah, if there was an adult who wanted to make that switch, that there's some utility there, but it really also then brings up this ethical question of You've got harm reduction for one group if they make the switch. And it's worth mentioning as well, we've got data now that shows that if you're both smoking and vaping at the same time, that can leave you worse off, at least cardiovascularly, than if you were even just smoking or doing one or the other. But yes, if you made the full switch over, you're going from about 7,000 chemicals in a cigarette to 1 to 2,000 chemicals in a vape, and you're going from tar in cigarettes to no tar in vapes. But what about that other side of the equation? The people who are coming on to nicotine, who might not have otherwise been there. And can there be a sweet spot, no pun intended, where we can offer the benefits of vaping without creating this product that's even more addictive and pleasant, that brings kids into this paradigm where they're still getting thousands of chemicals as well as hooked onto nicotine, which in and of itself has harms on the developing brain. There's a phrase from the docuseries that a parent used that also really stuck out to me, where she calls vaping an exquisite prison because it tastes really good and it's got this really strong nicotine hit. And then the question becomes, well, how easy is it to quit vaping compared to smoking? And I think that's the next horizon, right? Particularly for those going from no vaping or smoking to vaping now, like the young people coming up. How easily can you stop? What does that data look like? Because we already know that there are health implications, negative health implications from vaping alone. Or are we saying that moving someone from smoking to vaping is good enough? Like let's just move them to vaping and park them there and say that, there's really nothing, we're not really going to try to get you off nicotine entirely. Or is it even harder to quit vaping than it is to quit smoking? I don't know. There's a lot of lifestyle elements to vaping that can make it a lot tougher to stop in terms of being able to use it in more environments. You can buy these models with really large tanks so that you can just go and go and go. And I know that with cigarettes you can chain smoke, but there are still like these natural breakpoints when you get to the end of a cigarette where you could stop even if you're chain smoking them. Whereas with vaping, there's just so much right there at your fingertips, literally. Sometimes a lot more right there at your fingertips, that it's easier for that to go on for a much longer period of time. So I think ultimately those are just some unanswered questions. Like this can be a useful tool, but how we use it, how we market it, how does it actually come to the public also really matters. I think as well, like nicotine replacement therapy, at least in some senses, is can be prescribed, right? And I'm wondering, like, what if vaping, or even just flavored vapes, what if those were prescription only, right? What if those were behind the counter so you don't have kids buying them? But if you wanted to get like this extremely pleasurable, like strawberry, watermelon, what have you, flavored vape, you're not just going to buy that off the shelf with a fake ID, say, but you'd actually have to get a prescription. I think that could be a very interesting paradigm as well. Like, what if we actually treated it like a health product rather than like a recreational product, or again, something that's very easy for kids to get their hands on? And that brings me to the second point that I want to talk about around nicotine pouches and Zyn and the plant that's starting up. And so what's interesting about these, right? So for those who aren't aware, they are basically a pouch. You put it up against your gum, kind of like chew, but unlike with chew where you're kind of needing to spit all the time, it's tobacco based. This is basically just nicotine and flavoring that leaches out over time. So again, you have that pleasurable flavor, you get the nicotine hit. And the angle with this, and part of what we're hearing folks say is, well, this way, nothing's going into my lungs. So there's less harm to this, right? Even than vaping. And while we're still gathering data on, what can we find out about just like contacting that up against your gum for long periods of time, it would seem on its face to be true, right? That would be even less harm than vaping in terms of a nicotine delivery system. I think, again, though, the concern is when you start to look at its popularity amongst youth and young people in particular, and the fact that nicotine alone causes potential changes to the developing brain that are not present when you're talking about older individuals and adults. That's where the concern really starts to pop up. And again, we know that flavors disproportionately appeal to young people. We've already started to see these catch on with kids. It's always the new thing, right? What's new, what's hip, what's a new way to push back. If you recall back to the early times with Juul, one of the big appeals to that was that before parents caught on and teachers caught on to what was going on, there was like this rebellious aspect of like, I'm using this right in front of the teachers and they have no idea because it looks like a USB drive. Or I can put it up the sleeve of my shirt or my hoodie. No one knows that it's there. I can blow the vapor out into there. Like, look at me. I can vape in class. I can vape where I shouldn't. So there's always this pivot, right? When we talk about teenage trends, where when I was young, Facebook was the trend for young people. When I was in college, that it was just launching when I was in college. Now, it's not about Facebook, right? For kids, right? It's moved into an older demographic. They've moved on to Snapchat. They're on Instagram. They're on TikTok, right? That's where they live. And so there's always this pivot. And so it'll be very interesting to see where this goes in terms of nicotine pouches. And there does always seem to be this game of whack-a-mole that goes on between companies that deal in addictive products, regulators, folks who care about youth prevention like I do, where it's hard necessarily to catch up. And I think ultimately my concern with Zyn is if we look back at what happened with Juul, right? And there was this idea of, well, this is less harmful than smoking, so let's make a product, but it's based on selling nicotine. And that you can clearly see when you look at that history where that company took a pretty sharp left turn and things went south. And it created, largely drove a movement which has harmed millions and millions of kids now at this point. I look at what's happening with nicotine pouches and I wonder, are we going to see something very similar there if it hasn't already happened? Where, like, how are we marketing Zyn? How are we looking at Zyn? Or how aren't we treating it, right? Are we treating this like a product that is about harm reduction, smoking cessation, public health? Or is this just another flavored nicotine recreational product where we kind of know the inevitable terminus of where this goes with all of these addiction for profit drugs? We're selling nicotine, we're selling THC, we're selling alcohol, we're selling, whatever it is. Without a lot of very firm regulation, it seems to always drift in this direction of how can we make the most money in whatever latitude we have without necessarily thinking of it more holistically. Like, how is this going to cause harm in other places? Or do we know that it's causing harm? And we're just going to keep going for it anyway, even when, the signs are all there right in front of us. So anyway, that's what I'm musing about. That's what I'm thinking about today. Truly would love to chat with you about this. So again, if you'd like to join the conversation, please head on over to my LinkedIn page or to the YouTube version of this. I'll put that in the show notes. I'll put both of those in the show notes if you'd like to chat, because I think it's interesting. Addiction is one of these behavioral health categories where it's constantly shifting because the products shift, the companies shift. It's the only behavioral health problem that people literally try to sell you. And I think that creates a very different paradigm from things like depression, anxiety, trauma. And it means that you're standing on shifting sands. You've got to adjust how you're approaching it. You've got to adjust your policy, and you've also got to adjust your messaging to young people, because not to say that young adults and adults don't matter. They absolutely do for a lot of these products, but for nicotine in particular, a lot of the nexus for where the harm comes from is centered around teens and the habits they get into, how nicotine changes and primes their brain for the future in ways that aren't necessarily healthy or helpful to them. So for those who made it to the end, thanks for making it this far, and I look forward to hearing from you, talking to you again in the next podcast.